The November air was thin and wet, laced with the scent of rain and earth. A light drizzle turned the cemetery into a blurred canvas of stone, trees, and grief. Margaret Langston, one of the wealthiest women in the country, stood motionless in front of her son's grave. A polished granite slab that read Elias J. Langston, 1989 to 2017. Beloved son. Lost too soon. She had visited every month for 3 years. But today, something was different. A woman, young, dark-skinned, dressed in a cheap, damp diner uniform, was kneeling at the headstone. In her arms was a little boy, maybe 4, sobbing into her shoulder. Both of them were soaked. Both of them looked like they had nowhere else to be. Margaret's gloved hands tightened around the bouquet of ivory roses she had brought. She was 56 years old, matriarch of the Langston tech empire, and she had never seen this woman, or that child, before. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "This is private property. You're not supposed to be here." The woman turned her face slowly, her cheeks streaked with tears and rain. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't know anyone else would come today." Margaret stared, scrutinizing her, tall, slim, maybe late 20s. Her uniform clung to her body. The name tag read, Riley. "And who are you?" Margaret demanded. "Why are you at my son's grave?" The boy looked up. His eyes, bright emerald green, caught the light. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had seen those eyes before. In baby photos, in school portraits, in Elias's face every single day for nearly 30 years. The same piercing green eyes, unmistakable. "My name is Riley Monroe," the woman said, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. "And this is Caleb. I work at Gracie's Diner downtown. I come here because because he was important to us." Margaret staggered back a step. Important to us? Elias had died in a tragic highway collision 3 years ago. Alone, no drugs, no alcohol, no passengers. She had turned his life upside down looking for answers. No serious relationships, no engagement, no talk of children. His apartment had been practically sterile. She had found no mention of a Riley Monroe. "Important. How?" she asked, voice lower now but more dangerous. Riley looked her in the eye, unflinching. "Because Caleb is his son, and I promised Elias I'd raise him right." The bouquet slipped from Margaret's hand. White petals scattered across the wet stone like tiny ghosts. 3 years. For 3 years she had believed her legacy had ended with Elias, that her family name would fade with her, and now, standing in the rain, she was staring at her grandson, a child born in the shadows of a life she never knew her son had. But something in Riley's gaze unsettled her. There was no desperation, no appeal, just strength, steady, cautious, maybe even defiant, as if this woman carried more than just Elias's child, as if she carried secrets too. Margaret had no idea that this brief encounter was the unraveling thread to something much deeper. A labyrinth of buried truths, betrayal, and the kind of revenge that doesn't come in anger, but in silence and patience. 2 weeks later, Langston Tower, private office. Margaret's private library had become a war room. Her desk, an antique slab of rosewood imported from Italy, was buried under documents, photos, and reports from her team of private investigators. Single, no close relatives, works 2 jobs, lives in a 1-bedroom in the East End. Margaret read aloud, flicking through pages. No college degree. Caleb enrolled in public preschool. Frequent visits to Elias's grave. Her assistant, Jonah Kim, stood beside her, watching the storm behind her eyes build. "What do we know about the birth?" Margaret asked coldly. "That's the strange part," Jonah replied. handing her another folder. There's no official birth record, no hospital records, no doctor. It's like Caleb's birth never legally happened. Margaret tapped her fingers, a rhythmic, lethal sound in the Langston boardrooms. When Elias had died, she had turned over every piece of his past. Phone records, emails, friends. Nothing had indicated he had fathered a child, especially not with a waitress. She stood. Bring her to me, tomorrow, 2 o'clock. The building loomed above the city like a monument to ambition. Riley stood in front of it, heart pounding beneath her thrift store blazer. She had borrowed dress shoes 2 sizes too big and used her entire week's tip money to get a cab across town. Caleb was with a neighbor. She entered the glass atrium and was escorted upstairs by 2 silent men in suits. Margaret Langston greeted her in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a sweeping view of the skyline. "Sit," she said coolly. "I'll stand," Riley replied. Margaret smiled thinly. "Suit yourself." She opened a file. "I've done my research. You make minimum wage. You barely make rent. You can't offer Caleb what he needs. Private education, opportunity, security." "Caleb is loved," Riley said calmly. "And that's more than you gave Elias." Margaret's smile faded. "I'm offering you a chance," she said, sliding a check across the desk. 200,000. In exchange, Caleb comes to live with me. He'll get the future Elias would have wanted." Riley glanced at the check, not as if it tempted her, but as if it insulted her. "You want to buy my son?" "He's not your son," Margaret said coldly. "He's my grandson, and I'll do whatever it takes to ensure he isn't raised in poverty by someone like you." Riley laughed, low and without humor. "Someone like me? You mean someone who works, who struggles, who reads bedtime stories and wipes tears at 2 a.m. and celebrates every scraped knee like a badge of honor?" "You're not being rational," Margaret said, standing to her full height. "And you're not being honest," Riley snapped. "Elias told me about you. The broken promises, the absentee parenting, the gifts in place of presents." Margaret's hand trembled. "You don't know anything about me." But I knew Elias, and I know why he never told you about us." Riley picked up the check, tore it down the middle, and let the halves drift to the ground. "Caleb is not for sale." Margaret's mask slipped. "Then we'll settle this in court. I have lawyers, influence, connections. I'll prove you're unfit." Riley's expression didn't change, but her eyes burned. "Then you're in for a surprise." Margaret sipped her coffee when the call came. "Ma'am," her attorney, Charles Welling, said gravely, "we have a problem." "Go on." "Riley Monroe has retained counsel." Margaret scoffed. "Some overworked public defender?" "No," Welling replied. "She's being represented by Brennan and Whitmore." Margaret nearly dropped her cup. "Impossible. They don't take clients without political stakes." "They are. Pro bono." "What the hell is going on?" Welling hesitated. "They've filed an injunction. Any attempt to forcibly remove the child will be treated as discriminatory and unlawful." Margaret's fingers clenched around her mug. This woman wasn't bluffing. The small living room was filled with people who didn't belong in a one-bedroom flat. A law professor, an investigative reporter, a retired judge. And seated in the middle of it all, radiant in calm authority, was an older woman with regal posture and steel-gray curls. "Thank you for coming, Aunt Valerie," Riley said, hugging her. "You said it was time," the woman replied. "I've been waiting 3 years for this." Caleb was drawing in the corner, unaware of the quiet war being planned around him. "Are you ready for what comes next?" asked Professor Danilo Cruz. Riley nodded. "I've spent 3 years reading law by lamplight, documenting everything. Elias's notes, Langston Industries violations, the shell companies, the bribes. Amanda Lane, the reporter, looked up. Riley, what you've uncovered could bury Margaret Langston. Valerie turned to the group. My niece is not just protecting a child. She's defending a legacy. One Margaret Langston thought she erased. Riley's phone buzzed. Margaret. Let's put it on speaker, Riley said calmly. You, Margaret barked. You think this is a game? Riley's voice was soft. It's not a game, Margaret. It's history. Margaret sneered. You have no idea who you're up against. No, Riley said. You don't. Margaret Langston had spent her life building a fortress out of steel and influence. Her name opened doors, silenced critics, and bent laws. But now, a waitress from East End, with a soft voice and burning eyes, had just cornered her. And Margaret didn't like feeling powerless. You think lawyers will scare me? Margaret hissed through the phone. You're nothing, a speck. I'll drag you through every court in this country. On speaker, Riley's living room fell silent. I believe you, Riley said. But what you haven't figured out is that I've already been to war. I just waited until the right moment to strike. There was a pause on the other end of the call. A silence that wasn't fear, but confusion. Margaret was used to desperation. Riley gave her none, only certainty. You're bluffing. Then I guess we'll both find out soon, Riley replied, and ended the call. Amanda Lane, the journalist, looked over. She'll try to come after you with everything. She already is, Riley said. But we're ready. Professor Cruz nodded. The lawsuits, the public pressure, it's all coming. But if your evidence holds, it'll do more than protect Caleb. It'll expose everything Margaret spent her life trying to bury. Riley stood and walked over to the closet. She pulled out a fireproof box and unlocked it with a key she wore around her neck. Inside was a folder filled with documents, emails, forged signatures, offshore transfers, even photographs. At the bottom, a worn photo. 3 smiling young people. Elias, Riley, and a girl with pale skin and hazel eyes. Amanda's breath caught. Who is she? Riley touched the photo gently. Her name was Natalie, Elias's fiancée. She was my best friend, and she was Margaret's niece. Everyone in the room froze. She died giving birth to Caleb, Riley continued, her voice tightening. But she never told Elias who she really was, Natalie Langston. She was afraid that if Margaret found out, she'd ruin everything. Professor Cruz sat up straighter. So Caleb is the legal heir of both Elias Langston and Natalie Langston. That gives him a stronger claim than even Margaret. Exactly, Riley said. But Margaret never looked deeper. She never asked about Caleb's mother. She just assumed I was nothing. Valerie leaned forward. And that assumption will cost her everything. Margaret sat in her study with Charles Welling, her attorney. He was visibly sweating. They've filed a petition for full custody and guardianship of Caleb Elias Langston, he said. They've also issued a cease and desist against any contact attempts by your office. Margaret's hand curled into a fist. And the firm? Brennan and Whitmore is not backing down, he muttered. In fact, they just added Amanda Lane from the Daily Vanguard as an investigative consultant. They're planning a full expose on Langston Industries. Margaret's face twisted with rage. I want countersuits. I want injunctions. I want their lives torn apart. Charles hesitated. That may not be wise. Riley has documentation that predates even your acquisition of your brother's share of the company. Margaret's eyes flashed. What are you talking about? Your cousin, Michael Langston. You forced him out in the 90s after forging documents. If Riley can prove Caleb is Natalie Langston's son, Then, she's bluffing, Margaret snapped. Then why did she get a federal injunction? Charles replied. Silence. Margaret stood. I want her crushed. 2 days later, the Daily Vanguard. The first article dropped like a bomb. A dynasty of deceit. Inside the hidden crimes of Langston Industries. The article featured scanned documents, confidential wire transfers, and records of illegal labor practices in Langston's overseas factories. The front page was a funeral bell for the empire Margaret had built. Overnight, number Langston lies trended globally. Inside her penthouse, Margaret stood alone, watching the markets collapse in real time. Langston Industries' stock was suspended. Her personal accounts were under IRS investigation. And worse, the board of directors had called for an emergency vote to remove her as CEO. She dialed Riley. The line rang, and rang, and then... Hello, Margaret. Her voice was so calm it made Margaret's bones itch. You don't understand what you've done, Margaret seethed. Oh, I understand perfectly, Riley replied. You wanted to take Caleb away from me, and now you've lost everything, and still can't touch him. You little... Careful, Riley said, her voice suddenly sharp. You're speaking to the legal guardian of the last legitimate Langston heir, and your crimes are no longer secrets. Margaret's voice faltered. Why? Why do this to me? There was a pause. Because you never asked who Caleb's mother was, Riley said softly. You never once thought that the girl Elias loved was your own niece. You erased her, like you erased her father. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the nearest chair. Natalie? She died in my arms, Riley whispered, and Elias made me promise that I'd raise Caleb far from your shadow. But when he died, I realized protecting Caleb wouldn't be enough. I had to dismantle the machine that killed his parents. A tear slid down Margaret's cheek. Elias knew? Riley's voice hardened. He was investigating you in the last months of his life. He knew about the cover-ups, the bribes, the shell companies, and he knew you had enemies who might try to silence him. The words fell like stone. The car accident, Margaret whispered. It wasn't an accident, Riley said. Margaret clutched her chest. No. The people you hired to handle problems made him one. Margaret's legs gave out. She dropped to her knees. Elias, she gasped. I didn't know. You built an empire on silence, Margaret, Riley continued, but you couldn't silence the one thing that truly mattered. The truth. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, attorneys, business analysts. The judge sat like a stone, face unreadable. Riley sat beside Caleb, dressed in a tiny suit, holding her hand. Valerie was behind them, proud and unmoving. Across the aisle, Margaret Langston sat with her legal team, drained of color and power. The judge spoke clearly. The court finds sufficient evidence that Caleb Elias Langston is the biological son of Elias Langston and Natalie Langston, both deceased, and is therefore the legal heir to the Langston estate. Furthermore, the court acknowledges Riley Monroe's guardianship as lawful, appropriate, and in the best interest of the child. There was no sound, only the furious scribbling of pens and clicks of cameras. The judge's final words rang through the chamber. And in regard to the corporate crimes presented, the court recommends a federal investigation into Langston Industries. Proceedings will begin immediately. Back at Riley's apartment. That evening, Riley tucked Caleb into bed. Mom, he whispered, was Daddy a good man? She smiled. He was the best man I ever knew. And Grandma Margaret? Riley paused, brushing hair from his forehead. She forgot that love is more powerful than money, she said. But maybe one day, She'll remember. Margaret sat on a thin mattress, her name now a whisper of scandal. Her lawyer approached with a visitor's note. "Someone's here to see you." Margaret didn't look up until the door opened, and Riley stepped inside. She was dressed simply. No power suit, no entourage, just grace. "I came to tell you something," she said softly. Margaret didn't speak. "Caleb got into Haven Ridge Academy," Riley said. "Same school Elias attended. Full scholarship." Margaret swallowed. "How?" "The courts unfroze part of the estate. His part. The one you stole from Natalie's family." Margaret closed her eyes. "He's learning the violin," Riley added. "He's happy." Silence. Margaret opened her eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" Riley stood. "Because Caleb asked me if bad people can become good." Margaret blinked. "And I told him, it depends on whether they truly want to change." Then she left. And for the first time in her life, Margaret Langston cried. Not for what she lost, but for what she had never known how to love. Has anyone ever tried to bury your dreams just because of where you come from? Share your story in the comments. Your voice matters. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us. Family isn't defined by blood, but by those who choose to stand by you when the world turns away.